James, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. Good morning.
Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered was Caesar's great phrase. Would you say that Trump has done the same?
He hasn't conquered anything.
Is he not
yet.
conquering Washington? He's demolished the East Wing. He's taken over the Kennedy Center. He has, Steve Bannon says that the Congress is tantamount to the Russian Duma in the sense that it does whatever Trump wants. You don't think that Trump could be compared to a Roman emperor?
Well, he certainly has a imperial mindset as far as he approaches the presidency. He said this week that he would not ask Congress for approval of strikes on Venezuela. Yes, I think Trump has always had an imperial style as far as the presidency goes, and he's certainly compared to his predecessors upped it several notches. Although I think the shadow of the emperors, the Roman emperors, has always hung over the office of the presidency, going back to the Federalist Papers, and certainly the last half century and even further, it's been a concern about the office.
Let's talk about the Federalist Papers. What was the Founding Fathers' fear? Was it that the American Republic would descend into empire?
Yes. The Founding Fathers, they had several different fears about directions which the Constitution of the new country could take. They weren't just scared of an overweening executive. They
also of a mobocracy.
Yeah, there was fears of a mobocracy. There's fears of a congressional aristocracy, Congress lording over a weak executive and judiciary. So it wasn't the only fear the Founding Fathers had about the balance of the Constitution, but the fear of executive power certainly loomed very loomed over the proceedings in 1787.
But how did they conceive of those dangers, and how did they try to ameliorate or even prevent those scenarios from occurring?
Well, the Constitution establishes a system of checks and balances. The Congress has to approve certain presidential appointments. The Senate has to approve certain presidential appointments. The House of Representatives and the Senate come up with a budget, to disperse funds for executive functions, and so on. The president can veto congressional legislation. There are all sorts of checks and balances that you can learn in your civics class.
Who do you think was most apprehensive among the Founding Fathers about these scenarios? Madison, Jefferson?
The original sort of factions within the Founding Fathers, and in the first years of the American Republic, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans, which is the faction led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, tended to place more concern on the growth of executive power. Federalists, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, John Jay, and so on, believed that the American Republic needed a strong but limited executive. So the Jefferson and Madison would be the ones who most feared the appearance of an American sort of Caesar.
Do you think Madison would be surprised by the way Congress is behaving today? Was it in fact predicated on the notion that you would have men of virtue in Congress who would, as a matter of fact, defend their position vis-a-vis the presidency, which we're not seeing now?
Yes, there would be an assumption. There was an assumption among the founders in Madison that an institution like Congress would defend its prerogatives tooth and nail, but they would require sort of structural independence for Congress. They'd only defend their privileges, their prerogatives, if they were not sort of dependent, as placemen on the largesse of the executive, and obviously the way the party system works nowadays, which with Republican congressmen, apprehensive about challenging the president for fear of getting primaried or losing presidential support. That obviously is a structural condition that makes it difficult for Congress to defend its prerogatives.
There's a lot of talk periodically in America that we are headed the way of Rome, that we were moving from a republic to an empire. And the theme sounded over the past decades by Pat Buchanan. Then there's the fear of the decline, it's a different fear, but of the decline of American power and influence, that the empire is in fact crumbling. What do you think of those takes?
So we often, in drawing parallels between the United States and ancient Rome, we often conflate two different processes, right? The collapse or the decline of the republic and the decline of the empire, which happened several hundred years after
the empire lasted a long time.
It did, yes, and in the West, in Western Europe, it lasted until the end of the 5th century, and in the East, it lasted until practically the Renaissance, 1453. So we have to be careful in discussing these things. When we're discussing American power and influence abroad, oftentimes we draw the parallels with the Roman Empire rather than the Republic. And when we talk about American domestic politics, we draw parallels with with the late Republic, with the age of Cicero and Caesar, and so on. So we're really kind of there are anxieties in this country about both processes sort of happening simultaneously: the fall of the Republic and the fall of the Empire, the collapse of or the loss of influence abroad. Obviously, the American foreign policy doesn't operate in the same way that Roman foreign policy does. We have to deal with much wider array of rivals and powers in independent states. The Romans mostly had to deal with the Parthians, in the east, and German tribes in the north. That was the extent of the foreign policy problems they had to deal with because they dominated the known world. Now the question of imperial decline. That seems to be, to some extent, the Trump administration's goal seems to be to stave this off by dousing various conflicts around the world, preventing imperial overreach, right? Whether that's in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, the Trump administration is trying to keep this ceasefire in place, and then with Russia, Ukraine, Trump administration has had difficulty in securing any kind of Russian good faith in negotiations, and that's leading up to an increase in tensions between the United States and Russia, the end of restrictions on Ukrainian missile strikes. So the Trump administration wants to sort of in Alexandrian fashion sort of cut through all these problems, like a Gordian knot, and thereby stave off American imperial decline. I think that's how they see it, and perhaps focus on China. We'll get a better idea, what their intention and strategy is once the national security strategy and defense strategy are released.
What is your take on the late Roman Republic and Cicero specifically? Do you see Cicero as a rogue, in fact, or as a far-sighted, public-spirited figure?
Well, yeah, there are multiple perspectives on Cicero and his role in both seeking to preserve and, in many ways, also hastening the decline of the Roman Republic. I mean, I don't think Cicero has a tremendous legacy, intellectual legacy, through his rhetoric, through his mastery of the Latin language, his incorporation of Greek philosophical concepts into Latin and thereby the Western world. So his intellectual legacy is immense, regardless of anyone's perspective on his political accomplishments. He was successful in staving off a revolution when he was consul, a revolution led by Catiline, and, his famous Catilinarian orations. But Cicero didn't have an army. He did not. His career did not depend in the classical Roman way on military prowess. He was a lawyer and a rhetorician and philosopher first and foremost. He did not really have a power base. He had a great reputation, but he couldn't really contend with the grandees of his age: Caesar, Crassus, Pompey, Octavian, Mark Antony, and so on. So he didn't really have a leg to stand on throughout this career in the late Republic, when the contests between these oligarchs determined the fate of Rome. So I think blaming or praising him, you have to keep that in mind. Cicero does play a role in raising Julius Caesar's nephew and heir, Octavian, to a certain amount of prominence, allowing him to attain offices at a very young age and lead the Caesarian cause against Brutus and Cassius and Mark Antony, and that blows up in Cicero's face, because Octavian switches sides, joins forces with Mark Antony, and then has Cicero executed. So Cicero was by trying to manipulate Octavian, a much younger man who he thought was easy to influence. He actually ended up signing his own death warrant, and the death warrant of the Republic. It certainly wasn't his intention. But I don't think it's not as if Cicero had, I think, the chance to really save the Republic. He could at best stave off its collapse at that point. And he couldn't save it with another speech.
Where do you think the U.S. is in this phase of republic to empire?
Well, I don't think the situation is in any way as dire as first century BC Rome. I don't think the United States faces the same level of problems that the Romans.
But if you take Trump's rhetoric literally, then we are facing the version of an Ostrogoth or Visigoth invasion. He says we're at war with these drug smugglers. I'm curious what your take is.
Well, I think if you look at the decline of the Roman Republic, it's easy to shift blame on either populism, which would as represented by figures like Caesar or the Gracchi, or oligarchical inertia represented by the Senate, Cicero, and Cato, and those sorts of figures.
But a form of a deep state.
Yeah, that's that might be how the Romans would think of it. But I think those factors were more sort of interactive and dialectical and playing off of each other. They contributed to a slide towards violence in the context of political disputes via force. And so looking back on it, it's not so easy to say to blame one particular figure or another, right? There are all sorts of forces that you have to evaluate their effect on things. And I suppose if things turn out badly, you might say the same thing about the American Republic. I certainly hope not, but I think you have to take a wider perspective.
But so you are basically more optimistic about the U.S.'s future.
Yes, I don't think that you have to understand that the Roman Republic existed in a largely zero-sum, land-based economy that makes the struggle for resources between elites much more intense. We have an industrial or post-industrial economy. It certainly has its problems, but I don't think the same structural conditions are in place that made the Roman Republic more frail when it came into contact with, or once it came into a position of hegemony over the Mediterranean. I think we have to be careful in drawing these parallels because it was just a very different society, different set of incentives. As always, I think we should be vigilant to a rupture in the balance of our Constitution, and any attempts by the executive by Trump to expand war powers, as he's doing in Venezuela. But the situation does not seem quite as dire as it was in the first century BC.
So Jeffrey Rosen, who's president of the National Constitution Center, has a new book out, getting at something you talked about earlier, which is this battle between the Washington-Hamilton wing and the Jefferson vision, Madisonian vision. Which, do you think that that's a useful construct for looking at the battle over power in the United States? In his new book, Rosen uses that as a template to examine various critical passages in American history, including the New Deal and then the Trump era today, the battle for power and influence between the executive and the other branches of government.
Yeah, well, not having read Mr. Rosen's book, I can't speak to the particulars, but yeah, that does there is a Hamiltonian and a Jeffersonian tradition in American politics, and that seems to exist on both sides of the political divide. I think there's a conservative Hamiltonian tradition, there's a Democrat, liberal
because
Hamiltonian
FDR
tradition.
tapped into Jefferson as well.
Yeah, Jefferson, and Jackson, right? Arthur Schlesinger wrote The Age of Jackson as a sort of
PN.
As a way to show that the New Deal had a sort of history, had a prehistory, it had a tradition in American politics. So the tendencies exist not so much in Manichaean struggle, I think, because they're not always embodied at any one time by one political party or another, but they exist in strains within both traditions, within the liberal tradition and the conservative tradition.
So is the bottom line that looking back to Rome is in fact of somewhat limited utility in examining conflicts in America?
I think it's always been of somewhat limited utility. I mean, I love reading about the Romans. I can't read enough about them, but
why?
Well, they're both so, as others have said, they're both the Romans are both strange to us and familiar. They live in a very different moral universe, a polytheistic, pagan, Nietzschean kind of universe based in values of strength and prowess, very, very different from modern, Christian and Enlightenment values. So they're strange to us in that respect, and often and very, very, very brutal. But it's also the origin of a lot of our thinking around government, around the balanced constitution, ordered liberty, and that sort of thing, representative democracy. So that I think in that kind of paradox, that's where a lot of that's where my own fascination, where the fascination of others comes from. So I think ancient history, simply by the fact that it's ancient, will always be at a distance to us, and the fact that the United States was established, a large federal republic, defies, I think, the Roman example. The Roman example showed that city-states institutions would collapse when it came into contact with a larger imperial reality. But the American federal system, I think, disproved this idea that you could only have representative or democratic institutions in a small state. So in that respect, even though Americans like to see themselves as the inheritors of the Roman tradition, in a lot of ways, what makes America great is that we've defied the Roman example for many years, and we should continue to defy it. I think. So yes, it's of limited utility, but it's still of utility. There's still a lot to learn. I think it's important to learn about other ancient empires as well, non-Western ones, Abbasids, the various Chinese dynasties, Indian empires, the Mughals, the Cholas, the Ming Dynasty.
Yeah, I've always thought there is something a little solipsistic about focusing international relations on 19th century Europe, for example.
Yeah, that too. I mean, the IR departments tend to focus on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, or the concert system of Metternich, World War I, World War II, and obviously these are important historical events and processes, but it's not everything. And I think there's a lot more to learn in the rest of the world.
Let me ask you as a final question: the United States has been in a kind of gridlock for a couple decades now politically. Each side has been hammering at the other, but hasn't really gotten anywhere. Is Trump, in fact, the disruptor, and even if he is claiming more sort of Caesar-like powers, is that something that both Republicans and Democrats are going to aspire to now that Trump has broken the mold, so to speak? Is this the new political system that we're going to live in for maybe 50 to 70 years?
Yeah, I think that's pretty likely. I mean, the thing about executive power, if we know anything about it, is that it continues to expand and arrogate powers to it, regardless of which party comes into power. And Trump has certainly it's certainly pushed the limits. Or is pushing well past the limits.
It's interesting that a conservative is doing this, since the whole argument of Burnham and others has been there's been a strong conservative movement against excessive power concentrated in the presidency.
Yeah, I think that the way the Trumpian right sees that is that there has been a concentration of power in this kind of bureaucracy or the deep state over the last few decades, and that's the power that has to be disassembled, and you need a more powerful executive to disassemble and reconfigure that system of power. I mean, you can't simply do it through Congress. That seems to be their the post Bush and Trump era conservative style, right? I mean, it depends on a view of a strong executive to set things right, and the Caesarist model, right?
Well, James, it is comforting to have your sanguine diagnosis that the United States is not headed, at least for now, the way of the Roman Empire.
Not the same conditions, yeah.
Thank you.